Something truly unbelievable happened inside a luxury watch boutique, an encounter so shocking, so hilarious, and so unexpected that the entire store was left in stunned silence. And at the center of it all, Keanu Reeves. But this wasn't just any ordinary day. It was a day that would teach a certain high-end store employee the greatest lesson of her life, one she would never forget. Inside the gleaming boutique, where elegant timepieces lined the walls and the scent of polished mahogany filled the air, a well-dressed employee stood behind the counter. She was poised, confident, and in her mind completely in control. This store catered to only the wealthiest clientele, people who could afford watches that cost more than most people's yearly salaries. Then an old woman entered. She was dressed simply, holding a small box in her hands. There was nothing about her that screamed wealth or status. The employee took one look at her and immediately dismissed her as someone who did not belong in a store like this. With an air of superiority, the employee barely acknowledged the elderly woman, her eyes drifting past her toward a more important customer, a young man in a tailored suit. She had no idea who the woman in front of her really was. A few feet away, Keanu Reeves entered the store. He was dressed in his signature black leather jacket, his dark shirt blending seamlessly into the rich tones of the boutique. He had come here for a reason, but before he could reach his destination, he froze. His sharp eyes locked onto the scene unfolding before him. His mother, the woman who had raised him, taught him kindness, humility, and the importance of treating everyone with respect, was standing at the counter, looking slightly uncomfortable as the employee barely concealed her disdain. This isn't just a story, it's a revelation. And if you want to see how far it goes, subscribe now before it disappears. The employee let out a small, condescending sigh, clearly unimpressed by the woman in front of her. She glanced at the small box in the old woman's hands and smirked. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Her tone was coated with barely hidden mockery. Keanu clenched his jaw. The woman, the employee had no idea, was Keanu Reeves' mother. But what happened next? Oh, it was something truly unforgettable. Keanu's eyes darkened as he watched the employee's dismissive behavior. The way she barely concealed her distaste, the way she treated his mother as though she were an inconvenience rather than a valued customer, it was infuriating. But instead of stepping in immediately, he stayed back, watching. He wanted to see just how far this employee would take it. His mother, ever the kind and patient woman, didn't react to the disrespect. Instead, she smiled politely and placed the small box on the counter. Inside was an old, vintage watch, one she had treasured for decades. The glass was slightly scratched, the gold frame dulled with time, but it was evident that the watch had sentimental value. "I'd like to see if this could be restored," she said, her voice gentle. The employee barely spared the watch a glance before exhaling sharply. "This store specializes in luxury timepieces," she said, her words slow, as though she was explaining something to a child. "We deal with high-end brands, not whatever this is." Keanu felt his hands clench into fists. He had seen a lot in his life, experienced the best of humanity and the worst, but few things angered him more than blatant disrespect toward those who had done nothing to deserve it. His mother had come in with a simple request, and instead of offering assistance, this woman had immediately judged her. Still, his mother remained composed. "I understand," she said, "but I was told your restoration services are among the best." The employee barely held back an eye roll. "They are, but we don't waste our time on outdated pieces like this." She pushed the box back across the counter, making it clear she had no interest in helping. The moment her fingers left the box, Keanu stepped forward. The sound of his boots against the polished floor was the only noise in the suddenly tense boutique. Heads turned. The employee looked up, and for a moment she didn't recognize him. Then realization struck. Her face drained of color. Keanu Reeves. He was standing in her store watching her. Her eyes darted between him and the elderly woman. Confusion flickered across her face, followed by an unmistakable trace of panic. She had no idea how much he had seen, but judging by the look in his eyes, she suspected it was everything. Still, she tried to recover. "Mr. Reeves," she said, forcing a smile. "Welcome, how can I help you today?" He ignored her greeting, his gaze fixed on the box she had just shoved aside. He reached for it, picking it up carefully as if handling something far more valuable than she had assumed. "This is a beautiful timepiece," he said, his voice even, "and it's in the right place." The employee's breath caught. She was trapped now, unable to undo the mistake she had already made. Keanu turned to his mother. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the watch. She nodded and he carefully lifted it from the box. The weight of it in his hands brought back memories, distant, cherished moments from his childhood. He had seen this watch before on his mother's wrist in old photographs on special occasions. It wasn't just a timepiece, it was a legacy. And this woman had dismissed it without a second thought. He exhaled slowly, reining in his frustration. "This watch means a lot," he said, not looking at the employee. "And you said your store specializes in high-end brands." He finally met her gaze. "Do you know what makes a brand truly luxurious?" The employee swallowed hard. Keanu didn't wait for an answer. "It's not just about price tags or exclusivity. True luxury is about heritage. It's about craftsmanship, history, sentiment. A timepiece like this," he gestured toward the watch, "carries more worth than any overpriced accessory in this store, because it has meaning." The store had fallen into complete silence. Customers, staff, everyone was watching. The employee stood frozen, her mind racing for a way out. She wanted to say something, anything, to lessen the weight of his words, but there was nothing that could undo what had just happened. Keanu turned back to his mother and placed the watch back into its box. Then, he looked toward a different employee, an older man standing near the back, his expression filled with a mix of admiration and understanding. "Do you do restorations here?" Keanu asked him directly. The older employee, clearly more experienced and wise enough to know when to step in, nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. It would be an honor to restore this piece." Keanu smiled slightly and handed him the box. "Then please take care of it." The original employee, who had so quickly dismissed his mother, stood there, humiliated, unsure of what to do. She had insulted someone she should have treated with respect, not just because she was Keanu Reeves' mother, but because everyone deserves kindness, regardless of appearance or assumptions. And now she was facing the consequences of her own arrogance. Keanu turned to leave, his mother following beside him. But just as they reached the door, he glanced back. "Luxury isn't about price," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's about how you make people feel. Remember that." And with that, he walked out. What happened next inside that boutique? Oh, the consequences were swift, and the employee would soon learn just how costly her mistake truly was. As Keanu and his mother stepped out of the store, the weight of the moment lingered in the air. The boutique's atmosphere had shifted completely. Whispers floated through the space as customers and employees processed what had just happened. The employee, the one who had so arrogantly dismissed his mother, stood frozen behind the counter, her face pale with the realization of her mistake. She had not just been rude to a random old woman. She had insulted the mother of one of the most respected and beloved actors in the world. But inside the boutique, the consequences were only just beginning. The older employee, the one Keanu had entrusted with the watch, immediately took action. He lifted the box with careful hands, his respect evident in the way he handled the aged timepiece. Without hesitation, he walked toward the back room, ready to ensure that the restoration process was handled with the utmost care. His movements were precise, methodical, and filled with the professionalism that the younger employee had so clearly lacked. Meanwhile, the store's manager, an elegantly dressed woman in her 50s, had been observing from a distance. She hadn't stepped in before, but now, as the store returned to an uneasy silence, she moved forward. Her sharp gaze locked onto the employee who had caused the entire scene. The employee felt the scrutiny immediately. She straightened up, attempting to regain some composure, but the damage was already done. The manager's heels clicked against the marble floor as she approached, her expression unreadable. Without raising her voice, she said something in a low, firm tone. The words weren't audible to the customers still lingering in the boutique, but the employee's reaction said everything. Her eyes widened, her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to protest, but she didn't. A moment later, she disappeared into the back room, her posture stiff, her face tight with embarrassment. The customers exchanged knowing glances. Some smirked, others simply shook their heads. They had witnessed everything, and they knew exactly what had just happened. Outside the store, Keanu and his mother walked down the street, the cool air brushing against them. His mother's face remained calm, but Keanu could see the emotions just beneath the surface. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even upset. If anything, she seemed amused. She glanced at him, her eyes twinkling with that quiet wisdom she had always carried. "I didn't need you to step in, you know." Her voice was warm, teasing. Keanu let out a small chuckle, running a hand through his hair. "I know." She had handled herself with grace, as she always did. She had been treated unfairly, but instead of arguing or demanding respect, she had let the situation unfold naturally. And in the end, the one who had been disrespectful had been the only one to face humiliation. But Keanu knew he had to step in, not because she needed protection, but because he couldn't stand to see people treated unfairly. His mother sighed, shaking her head with a small smile. "It's always interesting to see how people treat you when they don't know who you are." Keanu nodded. He had experienced that firsthand many times. Fame had a strange effect on people. Some bent over backward to impress him. Others, if they didn't recognize him, dismissed him entirely. But his mother had always taught him the same lesson. Character is revealed in how you treat those who can do nothing for you in return. And today had been a perfect example of that. They walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes until his mother glanced at him with a knowing look. "You didn't just do that for me," she mused. Keanu exhaled, his lips twitching slightly. She always saw through him. "No," he admitted. "I did it because that kind of attitude, it needs to be called out." His mother gave a small hum of agreement. Behind them, the boutique doors opened suddenly. Keanu barely paid attention at first, but the hurried sound of footsteps caught his ear. It was the manager. She approached quickly, her face flushed, not with embarrassment but with urgency. As she reached them, she slowed her pace, trying to regain her professional demeanor. "Mr. Reeves," she said, slightly out of breath. She hesitated, glancing at his mother, then back at him. "I want to extend my sincerest apologies for what happened back there." Keanu studied her for a moment. She seemed genuine. "It shouldn't have happened," she continued. "I take full responsibility for my staff, and I assure you that kind of behavior is not representative of our store's values." Keanu said nothing for a moment. His mother, ever gracious, gave a small nod. Apology accepted. The manager exhaled slightly, relieved, but there was something else in her expression. "Also," she added, hesitating for just a second, "if you'd be willing, we'd like to offer the restoration of your watch free of charge, as a courtesy." Keanu tilted his head slightly. He wasn't surprised by the offer. Businesses often did damage control after moments like this. But he wasn't interested in free services. His mother smiled, but she shook her head. "That won't be necessary. We're happy to pay for good work." The manager nodded quickly, understanding that pushing the offer further would be a mistake. She straightened her posture, nodded respectfully, and then excused herself, retreating back toward the store. Keanu watched her go, then turned to his mother. You really don't want the free restoration." She laughed lightly. "Keanu, I didn't go there looking for a handout. I went there for a service." He smiled, of course. As they continued walking, a thought lingered in his mind. That employee, the one who had treated his mother with such arrogance, was probably still inside, reeling from what had just happened. He didn't wish her harm, but he did hope she had learned something valuable. Because the truth was, it wasn't about money. It wasn't about appearances. It was about respect. And if she had to learn that lesson the hard way, then so be it. This was a day she would never forget. And Keanu knew, neither would anyone else who had been there to witness it. As Keanu and his mother walked away from the store, the weight of the moment settled in a different way. For Keanu, the situation was resolved. His mother had been disrespected, the offending employee had faced the consequences, and the boutique had done its best to rectify the situation. But he wasn't thinking about any of that anymore. Instead, his mind drifted back to the watch. It wasn't just an accessory or a piece of jewelry. That watch carried history. It had been with his mother through the toughest years of her life. She had worked tirelessly, sacrificed so much, and never once allowed herself to lose her dignity. That timepiece had witnessed it all. He thought about the scratches on its glass. Each one was likely attached to a memory, some painful, some joyful. But now, it was about to be restored. Not because of its material worth, but because it deserved to be treated with the same care that his mother had always given to others. The more he thought about it, the more he realized something. The incident at the store, it wasn't really about the employee's rudeness. That was just a symptom of something much deeper. Society had a way of valuing people based on superficial things, how they dressed, what they owned, who they appeared to be. But real worth, that came from character. Keanu had spent his life avoiding vanity and excess, despite his wealth and fame. He had learned early on that material things didn't define a person, but so many people hadn't learned that lesson. As they continued walking, his mother's soft voice pulled him from his thoughts. "You're thinking about something," she mused. He glanced at her. She knew him too well. "It's nothing," he said, but the contemplative look in his eyes told a different story. She let it go, simply smiling and tucking her hands into the pockets of her coat. Meanwhile, back at the boutique, the aftermath of the scene was still unfolding. The employee who had insulted Keanu's mother had been pulled into the back room, where the manager was speaking to her in hushed but firm tones. The weight of what had just happened sat heavy in the air. For the first time in her career, the employee felt something she had never experienced in this setting: shame. She had prided herself on her ability to judge customers at a glance. She could tell who was a real buyer and who was simply wasting her time. It was a skill she had thought was essential in luxury sales. But today, that skill had betrayed her. Because today she had been wrong. Not just about the woman she dismissed, but about everything. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat stiffly in the small office, listening to her manager speak. She barely registered the words, something about professionalism, the store's reputation, and the importance of treating every customer with respect. But all she could hear was the echo of her own voice from earlier. "Are you sure you're in the right place? We don't waste our time on outdated pieces like this." She had spoken with such confidence, such arrogance. She had thought she knew everything. And then Keanu Reeves had walked in. The moment she had recognized him, the shift in her behavior had been instant. She had gone from dismissive to desperate, hopping to salvage the situation. But it had been too late. She had made a mistake in front of everyone, and the worst part, it had been entirely avoidable. If she had simply treated the woman with kindness, with basic human decency, none of this would have happened. Her career wasn't over, at least not yet. The manager hadn't fired her on the spot, though she had made it clear that this wasn't something that would be forgotten. There would be consequences, perhaps disciplinary action, maybe even a demotion. But beyond the professional ramifications, there was something deeper gnawing at her. She had seen the look in Keanu's eyes when he spoke about the watch. There had been emotion there. Not anger, not smugness, but something real. And it had hit her harder than any reprimand from her boss ever could. She sat in silence, staring at the floor. For the first time in a long time, she questioned herself. Had she been treating people like this for years? Had she dismissed others just as she had dismissed that old woman? How many people had walked out of that store feeling lesser because of her attitude? The realization was a bitter pill to swallow. Outside the boutique, the world continued as if nothing had happened. Keanu and his mother strolled past storefronts, their pace unhurried. He could feel the stares of people recognizing him, but today, it didn't bother him. His thoughts kept returning to what had just unfolded. He had stood up for his mother, yes, but more importantly, he had witnessed something, a small but powerful moment of reckoning. A woman who had spent her life believing status was everything had been confronted with the truth. Character mattered more than wealth ever could. Would she change? Keanu didn't know. But at the very least, she had been forced to face herself. And sometimes, that was enough to start a transformation. The sound of a phone notification broke the silence. His mother pulled her phone from her pocket, glanced at the screen, and let out a quiet chuckle. "What?" Keanu asked. She turned the screen toward him. A trending post had already surfaced online. A customer who had been in the boutique had recorded the scene. The caption read, "Keanu Reeves calls out rude employee after she insults his mother in luxury watch store." Below it, thousands of comments were flooding in. People praising Keanu, people criticizing the employee, some recounting their own experiences of being treated poorly in high-end stores, others reflecting on the importance of kindness. Keanu sighed. He hadn't intended for this to go viral, but at the same time, he wasn't surprised. The internet had a way of amplifying moments like these. His mother smirked as she read through some of the replies. "Looks like you've taught another life lesson." Keanu shook his head, amused. "I wasn't trying to." But maybe that was the point. Sometimes life's most important lessons weren't taught, they were witnessed. And today, a lot of people, inside and outside that store, had seen something worth remembering. Would they change? Would they reflect? Keanu didn't know. But he hoped they would. Because respect wasn't a luxury, it was a basic human decency. And that was something no price tag could ever define. The world outside moved at its usual pace, pedestrians hurrying by, street vendors calling out their latest deals, taxis weaving through traffic. But for Keanu, the weight of the moment still lingered. He walked beside his mother, his hands tucked into his pockets, his mind sifting through the aftermath of what had just unfolded. It wasn't the confrontation itself that preoccupied him. He had seen arrogance before. He had seen people judge others based on appearances, treating those they deemed unimportant with cold indifference. That was nothing new. But what stayed with him was the shift, the sudden reckoning that had taken place inside that store. The employee had gone from confident and dismissive to uncertain and ashamed in a matter of seconds. It wasn't because she had been exposed. It was because she had been forced to see herself through the eyes of others. Keanu had witnessed something similar before. People rarely thought about their own behavior until the consequences stared them in the face. And sometimes, even then, they refused to change. His mother's quiet presence beside him was grounding. She wasn't rattled, wasn't dwelling on the interaction. She had always been like that, steady, graceful. He had learned much of his own patience from her. As they turned onto a quieter street, Keanu's thoughts drifted back to the boutique. He imagined what was happening inside at that very moment. The employee, still in the back room, struggling to process what had happened. The manager, likely making decisions about what to do next. The older employee, the one who had stepped up to restore the watch, now carefully examining the timepiece, understanding its true value in a way the younger woman had failed to. And the customers, still buzzing with the unexpectedness of it all, whispering about how they had just witnessed a moment that would no doubt spread beyond the boutique's walls. Keanu knew that by now the online world had already latched onto the story. The video of the incident was circulating, comments piling up, opinions forming. He wasn't interested in reading them. He didn't need the validation. This wasn't about him. It never had been. At that moment, somewhere inside the boutique, the employee was still sitting in the back office, staring blankly at the desk in front of her. She hadn't been fired. The manager had made that clear, but there would be consequences. And worse than any professional reprimand was the sinking feeling inside her own chest, the realization that she had been so wrong. It was a rare thing to be confronted so publicly with one's own flaws. Most people never had to face themselves like that. They moved through life, unchallenged, never being forced to question the way they treated others. She had spent years believing that her ability to judge customers at a glance was an asset. She had thought she was simply being efficient, filtering out those who weren't worth her time. She had assumed that wealth and status were the markers of importance, that those who looked like they didn't belong probably didn't. But now that confidence had shattered. Because she had been wrong. She had dismissed an elderly woman without a second thought. She had spoken to her as though she were nothing, completely unaware that she was standing in front of someone far more important than any rich socialite or businessman. Not because she was Keanu Reeves' mother, but because she was a human being. And that was what mattered. The realization made her stomach churn. It wasn't just today. How many people had she treated this way over the years? How many quiet, unassuming individuals had she disregarded simply because they didn't fit the image of someone she deemed worthy? A memory surfaced, an older man who had come in weeks ago wearing a worn-out coat. He had asked about a particular model of watch, something expensive, something rare. She had assumed he was just browsing, just wasting time. She had barely entertained his questions, answering with the bare minimum effort, just waiting for him to leave. Later, she had learned that he had been a serious buyer, that he had walked out of the store, gone to another boutique, and purchased the exact same watch from someone who hadn't dismissed him. Her manager had been furious. And now, sitting in the back office, she realized that had been the first warning, the first sign that she had been approaching her job and people all wrong. Today had been the final reckoning. Outside, Keanu and his mother had reached a quiet cafe. He held the door open for her, and they stepped inside, the warmth of the space a welcome contrast to the cool air outside. The scent of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air. They took a seat by the window. His mother, ever observant, studied him for a moment before finally speaking. "You're thinking about that girl." Keanu exhaled, leaning back in his chair. He didn't deny it. "She'll learn," his mother continued. "Or she won't, but that part isn't up to you." He knew she was right. People either grew from these moments, or they didn't. All he had done was shine a light on something that had been lurking in the dark. Whether or not she chose to change was her decision. But if there was one thing he had learned in his years of observing human nature, it was this. Most people, when confronted with the truth of their own flaws, didn't like what they saw. And for some, that was enough to force a transformation. Back at the boutique, the employee sat up a little straighter. The weight of her own mistakes sat heavy in her chest. But somewhere beneath the embarrassment, the humiliation, there was something else. A flicker of something new. The first uncomfortable step toward change. And that was what mattered. Keanu stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, watching the world move outside the window. He didn't need to follow up, didn't need to wonder what happened next. The lesson had been delivered. Now it was up to her to decide what to do with it. The boutique, now quiet after the commotion, continued its operations as if nothing had happened. Watches gleamed under soft lighting, customers browsed, and sales associates adjusted their polished smiles, eager to move on from the unexpected disruption. But beneath the surface, a shift had occurred. The atmosphere was different. There was tension in the air, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. Inside the back office, the employee remained in her chair, the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders. The manager had left her alone after delivering a firm warning. She hadn't been fired yet, but she knew her position in the store had changed. She wasn't seen as the polished, confident salesperson anymore. She was the woman who had made a public mistake, the one who had misjudged a customer and been humiliated because of it. And worse than the embarrassment, worse than the judgment of her colleagues, was the gnawing feeling in her gut. Guilt. She hated the feeling. But even more than that, she hated knowing that it was deserved. For the first time in her career, she questioned herself. She had spent years curating an image of professionalism, of exclusivity. She had taken pride in knowing the difference between real customers and those who didn't belong in a store like this. It was a skill she had sharpened over time, a quiet arrogance that had made her feel superior. But now that confidence felt hollow. She thought about Keanu Reeves, how effortlessly he had exposed her mistake without raising his voice, without anger, without cruelty. He had simply held up a mirror, and she had been forced to see herself for what she was. And she had not liked what she saw. The boutique continued to function as if nothing had changed, but for her, everything had. She knew that every interaction she had from this moment forward would be watched. The other employees, the manager, even the customers, they would all be waiting to see if she had learned anything. Would she change? She didn't know. But she did know one thing. She never wanted to feel this way again. You felt that, didn't you? That was no ordinary moment. If it hit you, hit like and let's keep going. Across town, in the quiet cafe, Keanu sat with his mother, both of them sipping their drinks in comfortable silence. The noise of the city was distant here, muffled by the warm interior and the soft hum of conversation around them. Keanu's mother stirred her tea absently, her eyes watching him. He knew she could see the thoughts still turning over in his mind. She had always been able to read him. Even as a child, when he had tried to hide his emotions, she had known. And now, decades later, that hadn't changed. She didn't press him, she never did. Instead, she let him sit with his thoughts, allowing him the space to process things in his own time. Keanu wasn't thinking about the confrontation itself anymore. That part was over. What stayed with him was something deeper, something about how small moments like this had the power to shift lives. He had seen it before. He had seen it in the way people reacted to kindness when they weren't expecting it. He had seen it in the way a single lesson, a single experience, could change the trajectory of a person's life. And he had also seen the opposite, people who refused to change, who clung to their arrogance, who dismissed the moments meant to teach them. He didn't know which path that employee would take, but he hoped that today had made her think. The cafe door opened and a burst of cold air swept through as new customers entered. Keanu barely noticed. His gaze was fixed outside, watching the city move. A thought settled in his mind. That woman had misjudged his mother because she had assumed something about her. She had looked at her simple clothes, her quiet demeanor, and made a decision in an instant. This person is not important. And she had been wrong. How many times had that happened in other places, to other people? Not just in luxury stores, but everywhere. Keanu thought about the countless people who had been dismissed because they didn't fit someone else's idea of importance. The way society often measured value based on money, appearance, and status instead of character kindness, or experience. It was exhausting to think about. But then again, wasn't it worth thinking about? Keanu set his cup down. He had no intention of dwelling on the day. He wasn't the type to let frustration linger. But he did hope that someone, whether it was that employee, the customers in the store, or even the people watching the video online, walked away with something more than just a viral story. He hoped they walked away with a reminder that every person deserves respect, that humility is more valuable than wealth, that true luxury isn't about what you own, but who you are. His mother finished her tea and placed her cup down with a soft clink against the saucer. "Shall we go?" Keanu smiled slightly and nodded. They stood, gathering their things, and stepped back out into the world. Behind them, the cafe continued as if they had never been there. And somewhere across the city, inside a small back office, a woman sat alone, wrestling with a truth she had never wanted to face. A truth she could no longer ignore. A truth that had the power to change her if she let it. And that, more than anything else, would determine what kind of person she would become. As Keanu and his mother stepped back onto the bustling city street, the air carried a crisp bite, signaling the slow retreat of winter. Life moved around them as if the events inside the boutique had never happened. Pedestrians hurried by, taxi horns blared, and storefronts glowed with their enticing displays. But in some small, unseen way, the energy of the day had shifted. For most, it was just another afternoon. For Keanu, it was another reminder of a lesson he had learned long ago, one that people so often forgot. The way you treat others reveals everything about who you are. His mother walked beside him, unbothered by the ordeal. If it had rattled her, she didn't show it. But Keanu knew that it wasn't the first time someone had misjudged her. She had lived a life filled with moments like that, moments where she had been overlooked or underestimated. And yet, she had never allowed those experiences to make her bitter. She had only ever met the world with grace. Keanu took a slow breath as they reached a quiet intersection. The moment in the boutique was over, but the ripple effects of what had happened were still spreading. Somewhere inside that store, an employee was facing the harshest critic she had ever encountered, her own reflection. And somewhere on the internet, the footage of the incident had already started to take on a life of its own. The video had spread faster than wildfire. At first, it had just been a clip shared by a single customer. Then, as people recognized who was involved, it exploded. Social media platforms flooded with reactions. News outlets picked it up. People dissected every moment, every word. Some were furious at the employee's behavior. Others focused on Keanu's calm response, praising him for his quiet yet undeniable way of handling the situation. But beyond the usual internet frenzy, something else was happening. People began sharing their own stories. Customers who had been dismissed in luxury stores. Employees who had witnessed similar attitudes in their own workplaces. People who had been misjudged, underestimated, treated as if they weren't enough based on how they looked or what they wore. It was no longer just about one employee's mistake. It was about all of them. In homes, offices, and coffee shops across the world, people watched the footage and asked themselves a question they rarely considered. Have I ever done this? Have I ever dismissed someone without realizing it? And for some, that question lingered. Inside the boutique, the store manager sat in her office, scrolling through the news on her phone. The store's name wasn't mentioned, but those who had been there knew, and it was only a matter of time before others figured it out. She sighed, rubbing her temples. This wasn't the kind of attention they wanted. The store had spent years cultivating an image of exclusivity, catering to the elite. Now, in a matter of hours, they had become a symbol of everything wrong with that world. The manager had dealt with scandals before, an overcharging issue here, a customer complaint there. But this was different. This was about respect. And respect was something that couldn't be repaired with a simple PR statement. She tapped her fingers against the desk, debating her next move. Her eyes flicked toward the surveillance footage of the store. Most of the customers had cleared out. The employees, still shaken, went about their tasks with forced normalcy. But one person sat motionless in the back office, lost in thought. The employee. She was still there, still processing. The manager sighed again. Maybe, just maybe, that meant something. That night, the city glittered under the glow of streetlights. Keanu sat in his apartment, a book open in his lap, though he hadn't turned a page in over 20 minutes. His thoughts kept returning to the day's events, not because he was dwelling, but because he knew moments like this mattered. There were some things in life you could let pass. Small inconveniences, fleeting annoyances. But there were also things that needed to be confronted, not with anger, not with cruelty, but with clarity. Today had been one of those moments. As his phone buzzed on the table beside him, he glanced at the screen. A message from an old friend. Saw the video. Classic Keanu moment. You really are the most patient guy on the planet. Keanu smirked slightly. Patient wasn't the word he would have used. He simply didn't believe in reacting with unnecessary hostility. Because in his experience, the most powerful lessons weren't the ones delivered with rage. They were the ones that forced people to stop, to think, to see themselves clearly, maybe for the first time. Across the city, inside the boutique, the employee sat at her desk long after closing time. The store was empty now, the lights dimmed. Her hands rested on the surface, fingers interlocked, her thoughts a storm inside her head. The world had moved on. But she hadn't. Something inside her was shifting, breaking apart the carefully built walls of arrogance she had spent years constructing. It wasn't comfortable. Change never was. But maybe, just maybe, it was necessary. She reached for her phone, hesitating for only a moment before searching for the video. She watched herself on screen, saw the dismissiveness in her posture, the way she had barely looked at the woman in front of her, saw the moment her expression changed when she realized who she was speaking to. Shame burned in her chest. But beneath it, there was something else. A quiet understanding. She had a choice. She could dismiss this, blame it on bad luck, on circumstances, or she could acknowledge it and do something about it. The next morning, before the store opened, she walked through the doors with a new weight in her step. Her colleagues eyed her warily, expecting the same sharp-edged woman they had worked with for years. But today, something was different. She didn't speak much, didn't make excuses. Instead, she walked over to the older employee, the one who had taken the watch after she had rejected it. And for the first time in years, she did something she wasn't used to. She listened. She asked about the restoration process, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She asked about the watch, its history, its importance. And when he answered, she didn't interrupt, she didn't dismiss. She simply heard him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Across the city, Keanu sipped his morning coffee, unaware of what was happening in that boutique. He didn't need to know, because he had never needed to see the results. All he had ever cared about was planting the seed. What people did with it after that, that was up to them. Because in the end, change never comes from being called out. It comes from being called to something greater. And that was exactly what had happened that day. The lesson had been given, and whether or not it took root, that was the real test. If you enjoyed this story, there's another video on screen right now. Go ahead and give it a look for an even more astonishing tale. And don't forget, we'll have many more uplifting and dramatic stories coming your way. So make sure you subscribe to our channel, that way you'll never miss our newest uploads.